Forward to cloud. Okay. All right. And now we should be recording. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here, especially early in the semester. We're still trying to get things up off the ground, or at least I am. So thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. My name is Maria Bane, and I am an assistant professor in communication sciences and disorders. So to tell you what that is, because most people don't necessarily know the academic name of the unit, we're in the College of Education and Applied Human Sciences over in the Wallace Building, and we are the people who train future speech-language pathologists or speech therapists. So the academic name and the professional name are a little bit different. This is my 4th year at EKU, and I am one of the new faculty innovators this year through the FCT&L, and then I'll continue service for a couple more years if they'll have me. So that's a little bit about me, and I'd like to turn it over to Charlie, my wonderful co-presenter and colleague in CSD, to introduce himself.
Thank you so much. Welcome everybody. My name's Charlie Hughes. So I am a associate professor in communication sciences and disorders. I'm also a speech language pathologist. It's licensed in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I'm also someone who stutters too, and I share that. I think it's important to share because number one, you're going to probably hear me stutter throughout this presentation, and also just to share some of my background is that I specialize clinically in the area of stuttering and also teaching about stuttering too, just the nature of it also. I'm just really excited. Both Maria and I are just so happy that you all have decided to come here this morning out of your busy schedules here. And we're excited to talk about a project that we've been involved with that is related to experiential learning.
Thank you, Charlie. So it looks like we have a number of people on the line. I won't go into, if it was smaller, I was going to have you all introduce yourselves, but we still would love to hear from you in the chat. Charlie will help me monitor the chat. And then at the end, we'd like to hear a little bit about how experiential learning might be something you're using in your discipline or think that you might use. So this is informal. Interrupt me if you have questions or comments, and we'll just kind of get started. So here are the learning objectives for today's session. And I'll start off just talking a little bit about context. Obviously, we're all familiar with EKU being a regional teaching institution. Our program teaches both undergraduate and graduate students. This project focused specifically on undergraduate education. And our undergrads for CSD are admitted in a cohort model of about 30, meaning they move through just about the same course sequence for the duration of 4 semesters. They're admitted as juniors, and they continue as seniors, and they are pretty much all bound to be future speech-language pathologists, which means they'll be grad school bound, because they do have to then acquire a master's degree in order to enter into clinical practice. The course specifically where we conducted this project was a voice disorders course, which is a class I teach. You may or may not know that speech-language pathologists do treat people who have voice-related concerns, whether that's a vocal injury, it could be singers, it could be people who've had head and neck cancer, thyroid issues, environmental exposures. So speech-language pathologists do a lot of things. We cover a lot of territory across the lifespan. And many people, including students, don't know that managing voice disorders is part of our scope of practice. So I have the pleasure of teaching them otherwise. And we really try in our program to sort of marry this idea that you have these academic courses that prepare you in terms of knowledge, but then you also expect that students will gain skills. So it's knowledge and skills. And in part to accomplish that, we have a variety of clinical practicum kinds of experiences for them. We have an on-campus speech-language hearing clinic where students actually provide therapy to clients across the lifespan under the supervision of a licensed and credentialed clinician. But we're always seeking to find ways to kind of bridge the gap between what we're teaching in the classroom and then what we might observe that student doing in the clinical space and how they're interacting with patients. It doesn't always quite transfer perfectly, as you can imagine. So Charlie and I really got interested in thinking about how does experiential learning help us with the clinical education model? How can we improve that kind of smooth transition between what goes on in the classroom and then what goes on in clinical practice with patients? So the problems more specifically too are not just what we see in our own classrooms. Much of the literature in our field says that speech language pathologists feel that they are not competent in managing voice disorders, and that's self-reported. So there's nobody who's looking over the speech therapist's shoulder going, "Oh, you don't really know what you're doing in this." Speech language pathologists are actually saying, when asked, "I don't really feel competent in this area." And that is something that I really want to be different for my students. And I want that to be different for the people that are in the state of Kentucky who have voice related concerns, because we are supposed to be able to help them. And, oftentimes this population goes untreated or underidentified because maybe we, as a medical community, as a rehabilitation community, don't always feel confident in how to connect them, how to advocate for them. So students often come to my class in voice disorders their senior year, fall of senior year. They're usually pretty apprehensive about it because it is heavily based in anatomy and physiology. And many of them get, in their own heads about that, even though they're perfectly capable of doing it. And they also often ask, okay, I've taken this class, I kind of know, but how do I actually do the therapy? Which, as someone who supervises in our clinic as well, I hear that all the time from students like, yeah, I read the chapter, I did the class, but how do I actually do it? And that got me thinking that maybe I was not always being as intentional as I needed to be in the classroom about modeling the skills that I wanted to see my students do and extending them opportunities to practice the skills that I was then expecting to see in clinical settings. So one possible solution to this problem, Charlie and I got talking, was to be more intentional about including pedagogical techniques that actually promote retention of both knowledge and skills. And part of that is by actually doing things in the classroom and trying to be more experiential in nature. All right, I'll turn over to you, Charlie.
Hey, great. All right. So one of the things that uh, we thought about as we were getting ready to do this project was to think about what's a conceptual framework, that we could use, some kind of foundation, some structure, to try to discuss why it is that we're designing this study, to try to analyze the results. And so David Kolb's experiential learning cycle is a model, a cycle that we used in this project to kind of conceptualize the findings and our thinking about it. And so with experiential learning and David Kolb's learning cycle, you see a quote there from his classic text where it says, "Learning is the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience." So there's something that gets changed, this transformation that takes place. It's like um I cannot unsee it, right? It's like I cannot unknow that now that I've experienced this, right? And so in the cycle, and in our field, I'll back up a little bit as Maria shared. We're a discipline where students are learning about knowledge and skills, much like a lot of your disciplines, I would imagine, that you teach in. Um, and so, in any kind of behavioral intervention, we're essentially teaching a person some kind of a skill, like a behavior, something that they're going to do um, in place of something else. And so, it's the behavior that we're teaching them that's new is a new way. It's a new way to compensate. It's a new way to cope, to manage, whatever word you want to put in there, that placeholder. A new way to manage this like communication challenge that a person has. That's more of a helpful behavior. And so with any kind of behavior, right, like we're all human beings here. With any kind of behavior, it needs to be practiced over and over again. There has to be kind of like a rhythm that's involved to it. And we need to experience that behavior and then reflect on that process. Like, how did it go? Like, how am I doing with that? How does that relate to what I already know? Um, so in the model here, in David Colm's experiential learning cycle, um, a person can really enter this cycle at any phase. There's kind of with all the eras there, there's like a flow to it, right? It's like it's not necessarily a sequential model, but you can enter into, the metaphorical stream anytime that you want within this cycle. But the first one there at the upper right-hand corner is the concrete experience. And this is where a person, right, in our case, a learner, right, like a student, right, many person has an encounter, and I really like that word a lot. Having an encounter with some kind of a concrete, right, visible experience. So they have this encounter with it. They're experiencing something that's very concrete, and it might be something that's very new to them too. It could be something that's a reinterpretation of something that they've already experienced before. So I'm going to give an example that happened in my life, unrelated to speech language pathology, and then we'll tie it in. I had a leaky faucet in my kitchen. Maybe some of you have had this happen before. And so I had this encounter, this concrete experience where my faucet was leaking. And so it wasn't necessarily new. I've had leaky faucets before. And so then I had this experience, and I tried to tie in what I've already experienced about encountering a leaky faucet. So the second process, the reflective observation of this new experience, so that green quadrant there of the circle, the learner reflects on this new experience in light of their existing knowledge, right? Already had a leaky faucet before. I know about this. However, things that might catch our attention in this, if there's any inconsistencies between our understanding, our knowledge, and what we're actually experiencing right in front of us. So what I was experiencing was previously in faucets, I had like handles that weren't working very well. So I said, all right, I'm going to take the handle and I'm going to try to close the handle as much as possible, like over close it. I probably damaged it more, right? But I realized that it wasn't the handle's problem, right? It was like, wait a minute, there's something new that's happening. There's an inconsistency. Right. I'm not an expert at all in plumbing. You would not want me to help fix your home maintenance projects. But right. So there was an inconsistency. It isn't the handle before I thought it was. The next step in there, that kind of reddish box there, that quadrant there, the abstract conceptualization. So then there's like a reflection that's done here where we may create a new idea, or we might try to adapt or modify some kind of abstract concept that we've learned from this experience, right? Maybe there's something inside the faucet that I don't know about, that I need to explore further. The last step there is that active experimentation. And so the newly created, these concepts, right, they emerge, right? They give rise to us experimenting and exploring. And Dr. Bane can share more about this idea, but in voice therapy and also in stuttering therapy, there's very much of a focus on exploring and experimenting and just kind of playing around with different ways of doing things. So certainly, right, with the kitchen faucet, I'm playing around with certain things. Should I take it apart? That might be dangerous. I might cause more damage. But I'm applying this. We apply the new ideas, and we see what happens. If I take apart the faucet, I realize, oh my goodness, there's all these different parts to the faucet. wow, I need some help, right? I'm going to call a licensed plumber, have them come and teach me about it, and maybe I can watch them fix it, and then they in turn can teach me, right? They can save me some time going to the home improvement store, saying, "Here's the part that you need. Let me show you." So we think about with learning is, and in this model in the learning cycle, it talks about this idea that a person progresses through each one of these phases or like stages of the cycle. Um, we really need the whole of the entire experiential learning process. We can't just take one piece. And this is what we all try to do, right, in our classes, is that it's not just enough to have an encounter with an experience. There's a reflective process that's involved in that. So we really have to have the entire whole. All parts are important within the whole of the learning cycle. Um, so throughout this whole process, it results to the formation of more of these models of what we're learning about. We're constantly going back to this. So Maria and I use this as a way as we're approaching this study, and also in how we're interpreting the findings and trying to make sense of all this. So I'll turn it back over to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
So, like Charlie said, we kind of used this model to then inform some of our research questions for this project. So, we were interested in exploring how do student perceptions of voice therapy change following various learning opportunities. So, how is their understanding going to change when I ask them to do different things, or when I have them do different assignments, or when I actually sort of force reflection? Because we know that we don't always necessarily take the time to step back and reflect, especially if we are not given a structure or a time or a space in which to do so. And then, our second kind of guiding question was, what role does experiential learning play in acquiring knowledge and skills? Again, in this case, related to voice therapy. So the way that we designed our study to look at this was we kind of had three different learning opportunities that students engaged in, and those are represented by the three flags you see on the screen. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that this was really just a reading and listening experience. And you can probably guess what that was. It was a very traditional instruction approach that involves reading a section from the textbook and then coming to class and listening to the teacher lecture. And I did that purposefully. I kind of tried to not make it too engaging. I mean, I did some active learning strategies where I'm asking them questions, but I really was trying to have that be a very sort of traditional lecture and reading experience. In the second meeting, they did more watching and experimenting. So the way I organized this class is I divided the class of 30 into two mini classes of 15, and one group of 15 came on Monday, and then the second group of 15 came on Wednesday. And that was so I could have kind of a smaller class size and really spend more time explaining with them and actually showing them some things. So I ran this class kind of workshop style, and I'm actually showing them vocal exercises, vocal techniques. I'm doing something and then they're doing it back just as a class. No one's put on the spot. They don't have to do it by themselves necessarily. They might break up into groups of two or three and try to kind of experiment with some of the skills I'm teaching them. So they're getting the opportunity to actually try the technique or the exercise, to hear how it sounds, both from me and for themselves, to feel how it feels, and then to try to change it if it's not exactly matching the model that I provided. And then we talked a lot during this class about what does therapy actually look like in a room with a client, with a patient. How would the speech pathologist explain what is going on, and what tools would you need to be able to teach these? What kinds of tips and tricks do we typically use in order to teach people to do these successfully? Because you can't just show somebody and then have them do it. Usually you have to provide some feedback and some scaffolding. And then in the third experience, they got an opportunity to practice and teach these vocal exercises. So they had a home practice log, and they had to go home and practice these exercises twice a day, every day for 1 week, which is only about a tenth of what we ask patients to do, actually. So most patients will do these for 8 to 12 weeks, and I asked twice a day, every day. And I asked my students to do them twice a day for 1 week, and they had to record, some data on themselves. And then at the end of that week, when they felt confident with their skill, they had to teach another person the skill. And it had to be someone who was not in the class, who was not familiar with the vocal exercises. Most of them picked somebody they knew, like a boyfriend or a roommate or a parent, which is probably something I would change next time, because we don't typically get to treat or want to treat our own family members or our own significant others in clinical settings. But, it was really just about having the opportunity to actually have to teach somebody else how to do something that they had been practicing. So, after each one of these learning experiences, the students engaged in a written self reflection. I'll show you those questions in a second. And then they also rated their own skills on a scale I developed, which I'll also show you. So, there were basically 3 points in time where we collected data from them. These were our self-reflection questions. They stayed more or less the same at all 3 time points. So we asked them to share with us in written form, what do you now understand about voice therapy that you didn't before? How did your impressions change? What was challenging, satisfying, or surprising? What was effective or ineffective? So what worked? And what would you do differently? And then in terms of rating their own skills, we developed a series of questions that asked students to indicate how well they would be able to do each of these things listed. So how well would you be able to recall facts about vocal exercises, describe or explain their purpose, demonstrate them, discriminate whether they're done correctly or incorrectly, critique performance, so offer some kind of feedback about how to make it better, how to fix it, and then adapt or modify exercises for different situations. And you may already recognize some of these verbs: recall, describe, demonstrate, discriminate. Those are from Bloom's taxonomy. So the idea was that we are asking them to rate a skill that is appearing in a higher category of learning as we go down the list here. So that we're looking not only at their ability to remember facts, but then also their ability to kind of analyze and evaluate and create some of those higher categories of learning that may be more difficult to achieve, especially when a concept is new, and then also at the undergraduate level with people who really have somewhat limited clinical experience at this point in their careers, which is exactly where they should be. That's okay. But what pedagogical strategies might encourage and promote and foster these higher categories of learning more quickly? And so the rating that they provided was just done on a simple 100 mm visual analog scale, like what you see at the bottom of the screen here. So that line is exactly 100 mm, and then they're rating, okay, I would not at all be able to recall any facts about these exercises, or I'd be completely able to. And they're marking a tick on that line based on where they think they are. So in this example, when I looked at data and I started analyzing data, I'm just taking a ruler and measuring how far that tick mark is from the end of the line. So this is probably 50 mm out of 100. They're a 50. And then I'm looking at how that rating changes over time following each learning experience. So I'll share with you first the quantitative ratings of the data. You can see here in this graph that on the left side, we've got their average self-rating. So that's the average of all the students who provided consent for participation. So this was an assignment that all students had to do, but they're consenting with IRB consent, whether or not they agree to have their data included in the study. So I think it was 28 out of the 30 signed the consent form. So their average self-rating according to that 100 mm visual analog scale is represented over here. on the y-axis. And then down here, these groupings are showing you, phase one. So that was read the textbook and listen to lecture. Phase two, where it was kind of workshop style experimentation, call and response. I do it, you do it, we try it together. And then phase three, which was go home, practice it by yourself, and teach it to somebody else. And then the different bar colors are showing you those different categories of learning according to Bloom's taxonomy, with these blue shades being those lower categories of learning, and then the warmer shades being higher categories of learning. So what we noticed immediately was that with each opportunity to learn, students rated their knowledge and skills as higher after each opportunity, which isn't necessarily surprising because they're getting exposure to kind of some of the same concepts, the same ideas over and over again, just in different ways. And I didn't share statistics on the slide, but we did run t-tests, and those were significant increases at each point in time. And what was more interesting to us, though, was that the lower categories of learning, these blue shades, stayed more stable over time. So we do still see an increase, right? They're still improving in their ability to remember and understand, but we see a bigger increase in these warmer shades. So, those like create and analyze and evaluate, those are actually increasing more over time, which suggested to us that the more experiential learning we provided, the greater the level of learning in higher categories of learning according to Bloom's taxonomy. And I'll turn it over to Charlie to share qualitative findings.
Great. So as part of the study also, we analyzed just the narrative reports from students. And so through the qualitative methodology that we incorporated, we found that there were three major themes that emerged from the stories that students were sharing through these narrative A accounts. And so you'll see those that are there. One of them was related to like evolving and changing, growing. And it's the students' willingness to change as time goes on, as they experience these techniques in each time that they do it. Another one was about understanding and having kind of a deeper appreciation of the therapeutic relationship that exists between a speech language pathologist and their client. Realizing that there, as you can see there, like give and take, right, with another person. So in our discipline, we work with humans. And so there's a give and take in any kind of relationship. So students really talked about what does that specifically look like in a therapeutic context. And then also the last major theme there was related to just appreciating voice therapy in general. And this idea of I understand voice therapy because I have experienced a part of it, right? And so we'll dive in a little bit here, and we'll talk about each one of those themes. So the first one was related to evolving and growing. So these were just some of the responses from students here. In growing, they said it feels new, it can be daunting, feels silly. We've kind of talked about that idea with some of the A approaches. Being vulnerable, being willing to do something that you're asking your client to do. So through trial and error, also another quote there, my skills have grown. So it's kind of that idea with the experiential learning piece. Now that I've experienced it, I'm going back to the cycle again, and I'm revisiting that. I'm seeing what is something that is inconsistent that's occurred, and I'm growing from that. Another person said, I now understand that voice therapy is a process that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. So appreciating that growing. And someone saying that it was satisfying, right, to figure this out, to figure out perhaps that voice therapy takes time. So we'll go to the next one here, the other major theme. And that was that idea of like the therapeutic relationship, or sometimes referred to as like therapeutic alliance. So the therapeutic alliance and understanding that, right, the time and effort go into this, that this experience, with experiencing voice techniques can be frustrating. I need to be self-aware. I have to monitor. Another one there, I know now just how important patient buy-in is for successful therapy. So understanding like the why, like why are we doing this? Why are you asking me to do this? I'm having a hard time understanding, what this has to do with anything that we're working on. Um, so another person help me put myself in the patient's shoes. And so empathy is such an important part of our discipline. And also the idea of compassion too. So not just putting yourself in someone's shoes, but also realizing how, now that I kind of have this small glimpse of what it's like, how can I better support you with this? Another one, last one there. I now understand the importance of empowering patients to take ownership over their own progress. So trying to empower patients to take ownership over it, because perhaps this person felt that they had to take ownership of learning the skill too. Um, and we'll go to the last one here, the last major theme, which was appreciating just voice therapy, just in general. So someone said I had a better idea of what the actual therapy might look like, experiencing it. Another person said I gained a greater respect for voice therapy. Really looking at this from all different angles, right? Experiencing it. Another person said I used to think the exercises were a little silly and ineffective. I also realized that I have a lot to learn, realizing that there's something deeper to this. We're not just doing these to be silly. There's a whole other aspect to this that's below the surface. Um, Another person said voice therapy involves active engagement from both client and clinician, and it's difficult to perform and critique. So acknowledging that these are really challenging, and it's challenging to self-reflect and to be aware. And so the students, all these accounts emerged through students actually doing what they were learning about in class. Um, so as we're moving forward here with the next one, I think Maria, I think, yeah, with like the takeaways,
Yeah,
do
yeah,
you
and
get
feel free
started?
to chime in. Yes. I'll just add to what Charlie just shared that one of the things that really stood out to me about student responses was that when I did some of my doctoral research, I actually interviewed licensed and credentialed speech language pathologists who work with voice disorders about the process of voice therapy and how they move through voice therapy and what that looks like. And so many comments that the students made were so similar to the things that I had actually seen years prior in some of my dissertation work, things that, more experienced clinicians said about, learning and realizing what it takes and how to partner with another person and motivate them. And I was just really excited to see people who are at the undergraduate level start to understand. I mean, they probably don't have the same depth of understanding, but start to understand some of these concepts that professionals in the field had been telling me about and were talking about and noticing in how they continue to evolve in their own practice and their approach to patient care. So just for me, it was almost like deja vu in some ways. And it's so hard often to convey those things to students because you say it, you're like, this really, that working with another person, like you have to have their buy-in and you have to, you can't make people do things. And this is effortful and it's time consuming and it's frustrating. And you can say it and say it. And really, we don't understand it until we experience it. I think there are just some things you cannot understand when it's said to you. And so that was just really exciting for me in terms of some of the qualitative findings. Anyway, moving on now to discussion, and we would like for you guys, we certainly have time for you guys to chime in. Charlie and I will kind of share some of the things we thought about, and then we'd love to have your thoughts about this project, where to go next, what you're doing, anything that's on your mind. So, one of our takeaways here is just that all three phases of learning were important. So, for me, and I hope I'm less like this now, but I definitely was more like this when I started teaching. I always felt like my classroom had to be like a three-ring circus of entertainment, or else students would not be engaged. And I have to try to do all of the things to get them really excited and really engaged, and it has to be hands-on. And I put all this pressure on myself and usually bit off more than I could chew to try to, make things stimulating for students. And what was interesting to me is that, the reading and the lecture were still important. That was still a valuable part of the learning experience. Now, it's not the only thing I did. And the literature supports this, right? The literature does not say we're not allowed to lecture at all. The literature says lecture, but then include active engagement strategies. So, it's a both and just reminding myself that sometimes we do have to lay those foundations. We do have to expect our students to read and come prepared to class and take notes and all of those things. And that is not any different with younger generations of students, I don't think. That's not going away. But we can also push ourselves as teachers to then take those next steps in terms of being creative in our approach. Experiential learning may then promote higher categories of learning. Those things, like I said, that you say them, but you just can't really communicate them, no matter how clearly you say them. They cannot be understood until the person sort of has an experience of their own and comes to this aha moment or this recognition of some of the, maybe they're soft concepts or understanding other human beings. That really you can't just read about or just tell someone about. And then this idea that prolonged exposure to ideas or situations that are initially uncomfortable. So this made a lot of my students uncomfortable. Okay, they're telling me they feel silly, they feel stupid doing this, they don't want to do this in front of another person, but it really ended up, based on their comments, promoting some of those higher level emotional skills like empathy and compassion. They started writing about, wow, I realize how hard this must be for patients and how frustrating this must be for somebody else, and how much time and effort this takes to try to work it into your schedule every day, 2 times a week. And so, these little things that we ask other people to do, whether that's our students or our patients or other people in our lives, they're not so little. And we have to have an appreciation for what we're asking, and then also make sure that that person understands why they should do that, why it's important. And I think about that a lot as I interact with my students. Do they understand why I have created this assignment, or why I have asked them to do this, or why they need to read, or why they need to take notes, or any number of things? So, those were kind of some of my takeaways. This is obviously a little time and resource intensive. I spent a good amount of class time on this. It's not something I can do with every concept, but I did think a lot about, is it better to teach them a ton of exercises and a bunch of different therapy techniques, or is it better for them to have one prolonged, meaningful exposure to one example that then they can learn from and sort of extrapolate some of those new ideas onto a variety of things that they might do with patients and onto other areas of the scope of our practice. So beyond voice, maybe they're thinking about some of this when they go to their fluency class or their language classes too. So those are kind of my thoughts. Charlie, if I've neglected to say anything, chime in and we can open it up to our other people.
Yeah, I will just echo everything that Ria said about the study here and just the main takeaways. Some other things that some main takeaways for me as we were analyzing the findings and, just taking part in the study was to try to normalize, that learning takes time, that it truly is a cycle. And I think that Maria and I try to do our best with modeling this to our students too. Um, as in the experiential learning cycle image that we provided. So that was from simplepsychology.org, and the information in there was from Dr. Saul McLeod from simplepsychology.org, who was summarizing David Kolb's model, which I really enjoy the language that they use to describe that, is to reflect back on what are the inconsistencies that we have between what we already know and what we are experiencing. And so I think I wonder sometimes as instructors if we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to feel like we have to have all of the answers for everything. And so I know that Maria does this too. And in my courses, I do this too, where I sometimes will participate in the exercise with the students. And so if it's a technique or approach we're using in stuttering therapy where we're whatever it might be, we want to stutter openly, we're trying to teach someone to do that. Sometimes I'll take time in class to say we're going to take 10 minutes to go out and we're going to openly stutter, on purpose because it's a technique that we need to model, for anybody else. And so we'll do this around campus and, then come back to the classroom 15 minutes later. It's like, okay, let's go find somebody and we're just going to communicate and do this. Then we'll come back together and like we'll huddle and we'll talk about this. It's like, wow, what was that like, to do this? Like, right, read it in a book, watched a video, somebody else doing it. Now, what was it like when we did it? And so it takes time. It's a normal process. This is a very common technique that's used in stuttering too, that a lot of people use also. But yeah, this takes time. But yeah, maybe Maria, we can just open it up. I mean, we have a lot of people here in the meeting here, and I know all of you have a specialty and operate at very high levels with teaching and learning. So I would really we really would welcome any comments or thoughts, questions, anything that you'd like to share. So I'm gonna mute myself here.
I'm just gonna stop share so we can see each other a little bit better. And feel free to put things in the chat. I will bring that up to monitor. What are your all's thoughts? We invite you to share thoughts, questions, ideas, things you're considering.
I just have one comment. Well, first of all, great presentation. I was taking notes about your study design for my dissertation, so thank you. So there was a TLI yesterday with Erin Presley and Bailey Lake talking about an open pedagogy project that Erin did in one of her classes, where essentially it was a graduate class, but the main project of the class was to develop a book that would be open, and it was essays, the students engaging with the work of a little known Kentucky poet. And so they used letters from the poet that are in the archives here as their inspiration, and then engaged with her poems. And so now there's like an open book online that they created, and like they designed it and published it, and that like the whole experience of like publishing and peer review, like they did that all in the class. And a lot of the comments, I mean, it was just interesting that they did report, being just so much more engaged in this, and they felt more connected to the learning because so much of it was on them. So anyway, your presentation made me think of that yesterday, and very similar. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. Good luck as you work on your dissertation. I'm glad we were good inspo.
Yeah, great presentation. I learned a lot. Appreciate your specific examples. I was wondering if you had any advice for how to implement these types of learning when the class is a little bit more like theoretical and there's less like hands-on specific, like exercises or things that the students are going to implement, and more, information memorization based.
I can start, Charlie, and then I know some of the stuff you do in your class, so then I'll kick it over to you. I was reflecting as we prepared this presentation about just the different disciplines that could be present. Certainly lab, like if you're in a STEM field or in other fields that have any kind of lab associated with it. I mean, I think that is very much an opportunity for experiential learning, especially if students are given the opportunity to then engage in that reflection and understand what it was. I have to say in college and I didn't go to EKU, so this is not a reflection on EKU, but I remember moving through labs just like, I've got to get this done and I have to fill out this paper and like answer this question, right? And I don't really understand the purpose of the lab. So I think that is valuable. Other approaches, like lab, at field types of work, certainly, going and even just observing somewhere, I think is valuable. I know that's maybe not experiential in the same place in the same way, but I'm thinking about like the pedagogy of place, because I'm working on another project with another colleague about how do we use just place, just the environment, going and visiting somewhere different, being outside of the classroom, to think about how that then informs our experiences. So Adria, I know you've already like visited the clinical skills lab over in nursing, and some of those types of things I think are still experiential, especially if you think about that model intentionally and think about, well, what opportunities are there to then reflect and think about my prior experiences and compare them. I don't think it necessarily has to be the student doing all of it, because part of it is just about developing new abstract models. And they don't necessarily have to do an exercise or perform a skill to do that. Sometimes it's just encouraging those reflection pieces. And even though we need to move through the whole model for learning, maybe there are times where we're focused a little bit more, or we're able to represent certain quadrants a little bit more fully than others. So I would just encourage kind of thinking flexibly about that, so that it can look different. And then Charlie is like the master of taking students outside and doing like stomp rockets to show like, physics and basic acoustic concepts and stuff like that. So I'll kick it to him for an answer because I know he's got some good stuff.
Thank you so much, Maria. I don't know. I enjoy going outside, so maybe it's an excuse to go outside. I'm just kidding. But um that's a really good question. And like just for all of us to think about if there's a class that's really theoretical, um how do you incorporate this? And when you asked that question and Maria was sharing all these great ideas, it made me think of a time when I was an undergraduate at Ohio University and I took an anthropology class. I forgot my professor's name. I wish I could give them credit, but maybe it's a common thing that's used in the field of anthropology. But I remember for some of the concepts that we were learning in class, they were a bit abstract at times. Like there's units that were really on theory of like culture and things. But one of the assignments that really stood out to me was the idea of going out in public and you had to just sit in one spot, like find a spot on a bench, whatever it was, out on the grass, and just sit and watch, like just watch people. And you had to just document what you were doing, or I'm sorry, what other people were doing. And I wonder if, and maybe people have done this before, if someone's on the call in this field or related discipline, the idea of whatever you're talking about, experiencing it, like viewing the world through whatever that concept is, as you're just observing other people and then seeing what happens, right? Like if whatever concept that it is, so you're experiencing it and trying to see it. Like I'm trying to see it and keep looking for it. It's like a filter, whatever it is, whatever concept. Where do I see it in another person or in our society, in our culture, in our world? I have no idea. That's just something that came to mind that I thought I'd share. I see someone in the chat. Kelly, you shared this that you did an anthropology class.
I was
Yeah.
a student. Yeah, and we did that. That was our assignment. It was cool.
Oh, cool. Cool. And then thank you so much for sharing this. Marcy, I hope I'm saying your first name right. That you do that in your business communication research class. That's awesome. Wow.
I think too, Adria, sometimes just like showing people, like I know Charlie does some acoustic lessons and he has them bring in an instrument. It can be like a little ukulele. And then they actually get to see like how are mass and vibration associated with pitch. And, you know, so I mean, what was like pitch is pretty abstract. But then kind of making it like you just added an experience and then or it could be like rubber bands. I have them use rubber bands and like they have to pluck the rubber band and as they stretch the rubber band it gets higher. So sometimes it's like literally a 2 minute, you know, brief example and maybe it's still experiential, you know. Matt, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just follow up on what Kelly said about Aaron Presley's class. I was in that session as well, and I was so impressed with what she was able to accomplish with her students. And I think what she was doing with her, and they're graduate students, but I think it could work with other kinds of students too. What she was doing was getting the students to experience the scholarship that they were both consuming but also producing. So I know in lots of classes it feels like our goal is to impart knowledge to the students, and so it's kind of that banking model of filling up their head with information. And I know that that's hard to get away from in many classes, but I think that when we can get students to understand that they can be an active participant, not just in physical activities, which I think are awesome, and I do some of them in psychology as carefully as I can. But I also think that getting students to engage in the scholarly process is also doing, right? That's a kind of doing that is really going to stick with them. And I can only imagine that in Aaron Presley's class, those students are going to take what they did with them for a long time, not only intellectually, but also in they actually created things, right? They created a website and artwork, and I mean, they did a lot of stuff. Um, but seeing our students as not just consumers, but also producers of knowledge, I think can be a way to really in any class, in any discipline, because there's scholarship in every discipline, and students are consuming that scholarship often, but they could also be, even in rudimentary ways, producing that. And I think that is one way of using this scholarship of engagement you guys are talking about.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Matt. Yeah, and the idea that students, right, can produce, when you mentioned about producing things, it makes me think of like creative arts therapy, like an art therapy, and using some of those principles of like, and back to your question, about if it's theoretical, right? Like draw me a picture or whatever it might be. Draw me a picture or a painting or something of what this theory might mean to you, or something like that, like producing something. But I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. Any other, comments, thoughts? Cool. Yeah. Well,
Can,
hearing,
are you
oh,
gonna
please,
can
Kelly,
you share your slide deck with me?
Sure,
can,
I can do that.
Thanks.
Well, thank you guys for coming. And if you hear from someone else who wanted to see this, it is recorded and I believe will be available on the FCT&L YouTube once they kind of process it and have it up. So probably in a couple weeks or something. So, but thank you so much for joining us, for your interest in the presentation and for the engaging discussion. I hope you guys have a good week.